It was supposed to be summer fun. Instead, Action Park became known as Class Action Park, a New Jersey water park so unregulated that employees were paid $100 to test rides before customers ever touched them. Families lined up for hours to get in. At least 6 people never went home, and the man who built it insured the whole place with a fake company he invented himself. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to a ski resort that only made money 4 months a year. Eugene Mulvihill, everyone called him Gene, was a stockbroker before he was anything else. He'd made his early money in penny stocks, working alongside a man named Robert Brennan, who would later build an empire on the exact kind of shady securities deals the SEC eventually came down on. Mulvihill liked to call himself the Walt Disney of New Jersey. His own son later admitted some people would remember him more like a berserk Willy Wonka. That contradiction, showman and schemer both at once, is basically the whole story of Action Park in one sentence. By the mid-1970s, Mulvihill owned a ski resort in Vernon Township, up in the hills of Sussex County, about an hour from New York City. Skiing was good business in winter. Lift tickets, rentals, a lodge full of people paying for hot chocolate and burgers after a day on the mountain. But come spring, all of it just stopped. The lifts shut down, the lodge emptied out, and the mountain sat there doing absolutely nothing for 5 months straight while the bills kept coming whether anyone showed up or not. Mulvihill's solution was simple on paper. If people would pay to slide down a mountain on snow, why not get them to pay to slide down it on something else once the snow melted? In 1976, he built an Alpine slide, a twisting concrete and fiberglass track that let riders control their own speed on a little sled all the way down the ski trail. It worked. People loved it. So for the summer of 1978, he went bigger. Water slides, go-karts, an entire second park built into the mountain's off-season. He opened it to the public on July 4th, 1978, with a Dolly Parton look-alike contest and a tobacco spitting contest, because subtlety was never really the plan. The location made sense on every level, an hour from the largest media market in the country, cheaper than driving to Six Flags Great Adventure, and offering something almost nobody else in America had yet. This was one of the first modern water parks in the country. Full stop. Families who couldn't afford a week at the shore or a flight to Florida could pile into the car and be sliding down a mountain by lunchtime. There was no template to copy from either. No industry standard for how a slide was supposed to be shaped, how fast was too fast, or how a ride should be tested before a paying customer ever got on it. And that gap, that total absence of a rule book, became the whole identity of the place. Mulvihill's son Andy later explained his father's actual philosophy, and it's worth sitting with because it explains everything that came next. The idea was to take the feeling of skiing, where you control your own speed, your own risk, your own line down the mountain, and build an entire amusement park around that same feeling. There's inherent risk in that. That was the point. In a world full of rides that told you no standing, no leaning, no letting go, Action Park was going to be the place that said yes. It sounds thrilling, and for a long stretch of years, it genuinely was. It also meant somebody had to figure out how fast was too fast, how steep was too steep, how cold was too cold, and the people figuring that out weren't engineers. From day one, when Mulvihill needed to know if a new ride was safe, he didn't call in a safety consultant. He offered his own teenage employees $100 to ride it first and see what happened. That detail, casual, almost funny on the surface, was the crack in the foundation. It was there before the park ever opened to the public, and it never really went away. For a while, though, none of that mattered, because Action Park was becoming something bigger than anyone expected. By the mid-1980s, the place had grown to roughly 75 rides spread across 250 acres, split into 3 zones people just called Water World, Motor World, and the Alpine Center. There was the Alpine Slide, infamous among locals for a brake stick that supposedly had 2 settings, extremely slow or death awaits. There was the Tarzan Swing, a rope swing that dropped riders into spring-fed water so cold it could stop your breath on contact. There was the tidal wave pool, generating waves up to 40 inches high in water, deep enough and crowded enough that lifeguards sometimes pulled 30 people out in a single busy weekend. There was the kayak experience, where submerged electric fans churned the water into fake rapids. And in 1983, they built the ride that would define the park's reputation forever. The Cannonball Loop, an enclosed water slide with a full vertical loop, like a roller coaster made of water and fiberglass and bad decisions. Riders climbed a rickety staircase, got hosed down at the top, and disappeared into total darkness before the loop threw them around at speeds nobody had actually measured. Across the road, Motor World let you drive go-karts with governors quietly disabled so they could hit 50 miles an hour, plus race cars and tank-style vehicles that fired tennis balls at each other, and speedboats out on a snake-filled pond. The numbers were staggering for a regional water park. Over 1 million visitors a year by the mid-1980s. More than 12,000 people through the gates on the busiest summer weekends. MTV filmed there. It picked up nicknames that tell you everything about how people actually felt about the place. Traction Park and Class Action Park, nicknames born half out of love and half out of genuine fear. Getting hurt at Action Park wasn't something you hid from your friends. It was practically a badge of honor among New Jersey and New York teenagers, something you brought up at parties for years afterward, like a scar you were proud of. The staff running all of this, mostly teenagers, some as young as 14, loosely trained, loosely supervised, running rides that had never once been reviewed by an actual safety engineer. Decades later, comedians, actors, and podcasters who grew up in the tri-state area still bring the place up unprompted, the way people talk about surviving a hurricane. It became a shared regional experience, almost a rite of passage, long before anyone fully understood what had actually been happening behind the scenes. And underneath all of it sat a second problem, one the public couldn't see at all. No legitimate insurance company wanted to cover a park like this. The risk was obvious to anyone in that business, even if it wasn't obvious to the kids in line with their towels. So Mulvihill did something almost unbelievable. He created his own insurance company. It was called London and World Assurance Limited, incorporated in the Cayman Islands back in October of 1977, before the park had even opened its gates. On paper, it looked like a real insurer, issuing real policies with real language. In practice, it existed to produce fake proof of coverage, so the park could satisfy the state's legal requirement to be insured without any legitimate insurer ever actually backing a single claim. Think about what that means. A ride tested by a teenager for $100, regulated by a state that barely had the tools to catch what was going on, and covered by an insurance policy that, underneath the paperwork, wasn't real insurance at all. 3 separate failures, stacked on top of each other, invisible to every family walking through the gates with their coolers and sunscreen, worrying about nothing more than sunburn. For a while, that invisibility was the whole business model. Nobody could see the crack. They could only see the slide. But cracks like that don't stay hidden forever. Eventually, they show up in the accident reports. State records from the mid-1980s tell a blunt story. The Alpine slide alone was responsible for 14 fractures and 26 head injuries in 1984 and 1985 combined. In 1986, the park logged 110 reported accidents, including 45 head injuries. Numbers like that don't happen at a normal amusement park. They happen at a place where the rides were never really tested to begin with, and by the mid-'80s, that math was catching up with Action Park in the worst possible way. And injuries, as bad as they were, are the kind of thing a business can survive. Lawsuits get filed, settlements get paid quietly, and the gates open again the next summer like nothing happened. Deaths are different. In July of 1980, a 19-year-old named George Larson Jr. was thrown off the Alpine slide and struck his head on a rock. He died a week later. The park initially claimed he'd been an off-duty employee riding in the rain, a story his family disputed for years, saying he wasn't even employed there that season at all. His mother later said the family was kept quiet for a long time and eventually settled for $100,000. 2 years later, in July of 1982, 15-year-old George Lopez drowned in the tidal wave pool. Just days after that, 27-year-old Jeffrey Nathan was electrocuted on the kayak experience after stepping on a grate that was carrying live current from the ride's own wiring. That ride never reopened again. In 1984, an unnamed visitor suffered a fatal heart attack, apparently triggered by the shock of the cold water under the Tarzan swing. Later that same year, 20-year-old Donald DePass drowned. And in 1987, 18-year-old Gregory Grandchamps drowned in the same wave pool that had already claimed a life 5 years earlier. 6 confirmed deaths. Some longtime visitors and locals believe the real number was higher. But 6 is what the record actually supports, and that's grim enough on its own. 3 of them happened in the exact same wave pool. Nobody should have been the second person to die there, let alone the third, and yet the park kept running, and the crowds kept coming, because most of them had no real way of knowing. For once, the state actually acted. In 1985, regulators shut down the Cannonball loop after it had only been open for about a month, a rare, direct intervention in a state that otherwise mostly looked the other way. But shutting down one ride couldn't undo what had already been building underneath the entire park for years, because that same year, the other crack, the fake insurance company, finally split wide open. A state grand jury handed down a sweeping indictment against Mulvihill and a group of connected companies, widely reported at the time as 110 separate counts. The charges weren't small: conspiracy, fraud, theft, forgery, tax evasion, running an unauthorized insurance operation. This wasn't a park that had cut a few corners here and there. This was a business built, in part, on paperwork that lied to the state of New Jersey about whether it was even legally allowed to operate at all. In November of 1984, Mulvihill pleaded guilty to 5 of those counts. And here's the twist that tells you everything about how this story was allowed to keep going. He served no jail time, just probation and $45,000 in fines. The sentencing judge didn't hold back, though. He said Mulvihill had acted deliberately, calculatedly, and premeditatedly, and compared what he'd done to a judge taking a bribe. Strong words. No consequence that actually matched them. So the park kept running, wounded, exposed, but running, as if nothing had happened at all. By 1989, there was a real chance to walk away clean. A deal came together to sell the whole resort, Action Park included, to International Broadcasting Corporation for $50 million, a price that would have let Mulvihill exit with his reputation mostly intact and the park's future in someone else's hands. That sounded like an exit, a rescue, a way out before things got even worse. It fell apart. The buyers inspected the property, saw exactly what they'd be inheriting, and walked away without much public explanation. The park was right back where it started, only now everyone involved knew a real buyer had looked closely and said no. So it kept advertising itself through the early 90s as the world's largest water park, while behind the scenes the numbers told a very different story. Insurance premiums kept climbing every year. Lawsuits kept piling up, well over 100 of them by most accounts, with one later court filing alleging as many as 2,400 injury claims had been made against the company over the years. And then, in early 1995, the situation got almost unbelievable again. For a stretch of time, the park operated with no liability insurance at all. Not fake insurance this time, none. It wasn't legally required by the state, and apparently litigating claims one at a time was cheaper than paying for real coverage. They finally bought a legitimate policy that may, as if catching up on a bill they'd been ignoring for years. Around the same time, the money behind the whole operation was collapsing too. Robert Brennan, Mulvihill's longtime financial backer, the man whose penny stock fortune had helped fuel this entire project from the beginning, was hit with a federal judgment of roughly $75 million tied to his own securities fraud. When Brennan went down, the pipeline that had kept Action Park financially afloat went down right along with him. By March of 1996, creditors forced the parent company, Great American Recreation, into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The debt was reportedly somewhere around $48 million, a number that would have sounded absurd to anyone standing in the ticket line a decade earlier, watching families hand over cash by the thousands every single weekend. The park that had once drawn over 1 million visitors a year, that had inspired its own nickname and its own folklore, was now legally insolvent, and there was no rescue coming this time. The last normal season ended quietly on Labor Day, September 2nd, 1996. Nobody standing in line that weekend had any idea it was the final one. They just packed up their towels, drove home, and figured they'd be back next summer. Through the winter and into 1997, the company kept promising a reopening. The date kept slipping. Employees kept getting laid off in waves. And on June 25th, 1997, Great American Recreation made it official. Action Park was not reopening. Not that season, not ever, under that name, in that form. This is the part of the story that actually earns the word abandoned. For roughly a year, the gates that used to process 12,000 people on a summer weekend just sat there, locked. The parking lots that once overflowed onto the shoulder of Route 94 stayed empty. The rides sat silent. The wave pool that had claimed 3 lives sat empty and completely still, no waves at all, just standing water reflecting a sky nobody was there to see. A place that had defined an entire generation's summers in the New York and New Jersey suburbs simply had nobody in it. It didn't stay that way forever, though, and that's where the story gets stranger, not simpler. A company called Pradium Recovery Fund bought the resort for $10 million, a fraction of what international broadcasting had once offered just for the theme park alone. Then, in February of 1998, a Canadian developer called IntraWest bought the whole property outright. And IntraWest didn't want the danger. They wanted the land, the mountain, and a water park that could actually get insured in the modern world. So they reopened it for the 1998 season under a brand new name, Mountain Creek Water Park. Safety First marketing replaced the land of yes. Helmets were required on what remained of the Alpine slide for one final season before it was torn out of the ground entirely. The Cannonball loop, already shut down years earlier, was dismantled for good. Motor World, the go-karts, the race cars, the whole motorized half of the property never reopened at all. That land eventually became condos and parking. Some of the water rides did survive, renamed and re-engineered into calmer, quieter versions of themselves, recognizable shapes with the danger quietly designed out of them. The park was still standing. Its identity was not. There was one more flicker of the old name. In 2014, new ownership briefly brought back the words Action Park, betting that nostalgia alone could sell tickets again the way it once had, decades earlier. It didn't really land. Younger visitors didn't have the same memories to cash in on, and by 2016 the name had quietly reverted back to Mountain Creek Water Park for good. Today, the site operates as Mountain Creek Resort, a ski mountain in winter, a water park in summer, owned since 2018 by a company called Snow Operating. It is, by every account, a normal, regulated, thoroughly unremarkable modern resort. Nobody gets paid $100 to test a ride before it opens to the public anymore. There are inspections now. There is real insurance. There is none of the old chaos. But go up on the gondola and you can still see it. A pale scar cutting straight down through the trees, the old route of the Alpine slide, still visible even now under decades of new landscaping. Local accounts describe old concrete footings and drainage channels still sitting out in the woods, well past the maintained trails, pieces of a ride that was torn out of use but never fully torn out of the ground. Former visitors and former employees still trade action park stories the way people trade war stories. Half horrified, half proud they lived through it and came out the other side in one piece. A documentary crew eventually turned those stories into a full film, interviewing former staff and writers who still remembered the exact sound the Alpine slide made, or which lifeguard pulled them out of this wave pool. The danger that eventually helped destroy the business is now, oddly enough, the exact thing people miss most about it. Nobody talks about Mountain Creek's water slides with anything close to that same reverence because there's nothing left to be afraid of and nothing left to prove by surviving it. Somewhere on that mountain, past the tree line, past where the modern water park ends, and the woods quietly take back over, there's a stretch of cracked, overgrown concrete that used to be the fastest, most feared ride in America. Families glide down safe, modern slides a few hundred yards away with absolutely no idea it's even there, sitting exactly where it was left, slowly becoming part of the mountain again.